Welcome to the Reel Rematch, the podcast where we unpack Hollywood's twin films, sometimes cloned on purpose, sometimes by accident, but always in competition. Today's matchup, the Capote Conundrum. Capote versus Infamous, two biographical dramas chronicling the same author, the same book, and the same murder case, released just 1 year apart. Which one captured Truman Capote's brilliance and torment more truthfully? Which one resonated with audiences and critics alike, and which literary portrait stands as the definitive take on a writer undone by his own masterpiece? Jeff, pleasure to see you.
Always a pleasure, my friend Justin. How are you?
I am well, mate. I've been looking forward to this one, actually. I hadn't seen either Capote or Infamous since they came out, so it's been almost 20 years, which just another, cruel reminder of how old I feel and am getting. But how did you go with the two films?
I got to tell you, I haven't seen either, and I'm sure I've seen Capote, but I know I've never seen Infamous prior to watching these two. So it was really interesting to revisit Capote and watch this together. In fact, in terms of this podcast that we run, how these are the two competing, basically very same stories, right? The making of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. But I enjoyed both of them. They were both interesting rides, that's for sure.
So same historical character, same period of time. Is this the twinniest of twin films and most doppelganger pair that we've done to date?
I would have to say probably to date, yes, absolutely. I think, we look for these themes in these twin films that we see, and that's what we do. But these two are literally two cars driving down the same highway. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, look, let's get into it a little bit, right? Because obviously, one man and in particular one novel, really captured the imagination. And then obviously early 2000s, it's coming back into the zeitgeist, right? I can only put it down to maybe there's renewed interest in as Capote as a cultural figure, but I think that's actually tied to the rise of true crime, TV shows and documentaries
Sure.
and biographies and otherwise, and it's kind of interesting, right? Because when we look at both the film Capote and the film Infamous, Capote was actually itself based on a biography by a gentleman by the name of Gerald Clark called Capote, a biography. It came out in 1988. While Infamous, on the other hand, was actually based on a book by George Plimpton's. Now, this is a mouthful, Jeff. A book that came out in 1997, Truman Capote, in which various friends, enemies, acquaintances, and detractors recall his turbulent career.
As you said, it's a mouthful. It's a mouthful. So I think that, sorry to interrupt you, I think that actually you can see that in the way Infamous plays out because they have the talking head interview style as part of what they do in the film, which is one of the differences between these two films. So absolutely.
So anyway, I think they've kind of nailed it, just calling it Infamous versus that word salad that,
indeed,
it's just like the, Peter Greenaway film. It's like, the cookies thief, his wife.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But so, again, there was some real competition. So there's actually studio ego and competition where these films were actually getting lined up for award season, actually going head to head, right? Apparently Infamous was actually in development first, but, Capote, was a leaner production. It moved faster and it premiered first. And as we know, it kind of, swept or dominated the awards season. And, Infamous, as a result, had to wait in its release strategy and had to reposition itself, releasing a little bit later. And it kind of got buried under the, success of, Capote's, sort of critical darling nature that it had for that period of time and otherwise.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I know that we always get into this a little bit later, but I think, once, the relative studios and filmmakers were aware of each other, right? They didn't back off. They didn't sort of, zig or zag. They sort of doubled down and sort of got white line fever, right? And it was interesting. It was really kind of like a who gets there first mentality. And first crossing the line actually won, right? And
it truly won.
It really did. And it was interesting because and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but, I think I really remember Philip Seymour Hoffman's performance because I've always loved Philip Seymour Hoffman. I think, may he rest in peace. But he was a truly, truly remarkable actor who gave us like 20 years of amazing entertainment in terms of the roles that he played. And he could more or less do anything, right? I mean, he was just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So, but then watching Infamous was like, Toby Jones is pretty fucking good.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, he's very good as well.
And it's kind of, it's a shame that, I'm not saying one performance is better than the other because I'm not really there to sort of like judge that. I might have an opinion on that, sure, and maybe that's a judgment in and of itself. But I just think they both deserve to be, lauded.
Yes.
And at least the Toby Jones one, I'd like to think that never really disappeared, but he does give quite a wonderful turn, and that's actually his first starring role.
He's all right. Well, Toby Jones, again, has been around forever. He's one of those veteran British actors who's been there for a very long time. You know his face. You've seen him in everything. He's been in British TV, British film, US film, across the board. But yeah, seeing him in this role as Capote and occupying Capote as Capote, do you know what I mean? Like he was the powerhouse as well.
Now, 100%. Now, again, I still wanted to talk about, some of the cultural impact of, really the book that shaped it all, which was obviously In Cold Blood that came out in 1966 by Capote. But before I get that, I've got to mention something just because you mentioned, Toby Jones. I couldn't help but notice, and I love to do this where one thing looks like something else, or one person looks like something else, is Toby Jones. You remember that guy in Total Recall, and he has a bead of sweat slowly roll down his forehead. He's chatting with Arnie and Sharon Stone.
Doctor guy.
The doctor guy. He's a doctor, scientist, psychiatrist, and, Arnie's on Mars. He's been wreaking havoc. And this is kind of like the last-ditch attempt to try and get, Arnie to come back to the reservation, so to speak.
Yes.
So his name is Roy Brocksmith, right? And I think that Toby Jones looks like, obviously, not now. I don't even know Roy Brocksmith, but he looks like a young Roy Brocksmith.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at him, it's like, rounded face, soft rounded facial structures, very expressive, sometimes sort of like impish kind of like features. They've both got, sort of, high forehead, like receding hairline. They've both got expressive, intelligent eyes. Again, at least in a sample size of like Total Recall and Infamous, right? They seem to excel playing cerebral, sly, or morally ambiguous kind of like characters. And both of them have very distinctive voice delivery, right?
Yeah.
And so, they kind of like gave me the same sort of energy when I was watching that. I was like, how about that? I mean, as you know, I love Total Recall.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd mention that on Toby Jones.
It's very interesting. I mean, look, Toby Jones, again, just to quickly look at physical features, I mean, the height thing was different when you look at Toby Jones's height versus Philip Seymour Hoffman's height, right?
Unpack it for me.
Capote himself was actually 5'3", so he was very diminutive. He was not a tall man, right? Which obviously contrasts a lot with his larger-than-life personality that he was. And, that's part of how, again, and we'll talk about how each of the guys plays him differently in these films. But Toby Jones himself is between 5'4", 5'6", so he's in that level.
Right.
Whereas Philip Seymour Hoffman was 5'10", right? So quite a dramatic difference. Now, Bennett Miller, the director of Capote, was a very close friend of Hoffman's and actually had wanted him in the film from the time he started writing it and being involved.
Right.
So they went very old school in this film. To make him more diminutive, actors would stand on boxes around him when they were having those scenes that they needed that to happen to make him more diminutive, whether he's speaking and presenting himself to people or looking down at this, who the heck is this guy staring me down even though I'm looking down at him.
Yeah. They
actually put them on boxes to make Philip Seymour Hoffman more diminutive in the actual style of Truman Capote.
And you know what I will say in terms of the other contrast, and I know we're going to touch on this a little bit later when it comes down to, production design more broadly, but specifically about the costumes, or maybe it's, part costume, part actor's choice and otherwise. But Philip Seymour Hoffman as Capote is exceptionally well dressed in a very classical kind of refined fashion.
Yes.
Whereas Toby Jones is a lot more flamboyant. Now, I'm not saying he's well dressed. I think he is. But yeah, certainly more, gaudy or sort of like leery, in terms of like a little bit more, I don't know if it's attention seeking or that's just me projecting or whatever, but certainly a lot more flamboyant, or bold in some of his fashion choices where like Philip Seymour Hoffman is just like, man, he's buttoned down. Like, I mean, he looks good. And like that sort of like overcoat that he's wearing, he goes, It looks amazing. I'd love to get one of that for the Melbourne winters, right?
Yes. No, I agree. And I mean, I think, again, that's part of the production design is that just the way they dressed him was, and he was always, I think that's it. It was, it's almost like he was buttoned down in dress and he was a bit more buttoned down of the character.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which, again, is just a production design choice, which we'll look at later. But yeah, I think, but it's also that was, you know, one of Hoffman's choices was to play him less than he was known to be, because he didn't want to come across as being a caricature, right? He didn't want people to think that he was caricaturing Capote. He wanted them to think of Capote as, you know, this is the man who created this great American novel that's not just the great American novel, but known as one of the greatest novels of all time, right? So, yeah, very interesting. Very interesting how they did both of those.
So, and I know you might talk a bit more sort of like about that as we get into it, but again, let me just rewind and go back to, you know, really, you know, what served as the catalyst for not just this, but a whole heap of other things. You know, the influence of Capote's book In Cold Blood was huge, right? I mean, like, you know, Capote, he called it, you know, a non-fiction novel because it's combining both factual reporting and I guess, you know, novel or novelistic, if you will, storytelling, right? So, you know, again, you've got dramatic structure, character development, and atmospheric detail, but then you've got, you know, that infused with extensive interviews, police reports, firsthand, eyewitness or observations and things like that. So you really have this like immersive and psychological depth, you know, that's created for both the victims and the murderers, right? And it kind of humanizes the criminals. It doesn't excuse them, but, you know, gives, you know, more of a textured layer behind, you know, a label, right? Or the crime they sort of committed and otherwise. And I mean, it was obviously a huge, massive bestseller and critical success. I don't have any stats on that, and otherwise maybe that's something for homework that you and I can do a little bit later, you know, but it also really, I think, lit the fuse that I think is still burning today and maybe continues to burn stronger, right? Which is the public interest in true crime as a genre, right? You know, I mean, the legacy of the book in that regard as well cannot be a sort of like undersold. So I've got a, you know, I guess a bit of a list, and I've kind of categorized it into sort of like three different parts, I guess.
Yep.
And again, it's a selective list. It's not exhaustive, so it's meant to be illustrative. But you think of the writers and novelists that, you know, In Cold Blood in particular really influence. So, you know, Norman Mailer, right? Another huge literary icon of his own, you know, the Executioner song, which he wrote in 1979, and again, it has a very similar structure and tone, chronicling the life and execution of, you know, Gary Gilmore. So, and again, you know, it's very, you know, almost template-y type, you know, recreation by Mailer. Joan Didion, you know, works of hers like the White Album and Slashing Towards Bethlehem, again, you know, there's a bit of an echo there in terms of Capote's mix of, you know, personal reflection, you know, the sort of literary voice that he uses, and, you know, the bit of, you know, journalistic techniques that he has kind of like peppered throughout. And then Eric Larson wrote a book in 2003 called The Devil in White City, right? Again, blending true crime with historical narrative. And again, it's you know, almost, you know, sort of the next iteration or next gen, if you will, of In Cold Blood. And then we'll get into filmmakers and film. The one that kind of like obviously hit me between the eyes is like, this is Fincher. Fincher loves this shit, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, you look at Fincher's Zodiac in 2007, and again, like, you know, both stylistically and structurally, you know, there's like very strong parallels to In Cold Blood, you know, especially just like, you know, as you know, Fincher's always obsessive about detail anyway.
Yes.
And also ambiguous morality. So it's like, you know, you know, him and Capote in some regards are kindred spirits. And, you know, In Cold Blood was certainly, I think, you know, one of the North Stars, I believe, for David Fincher. And there's also something else that I'll do a call back to Fincher on well when I get into my third category. There was then also, you know, a filmmaker by the name of Richard Brooks. And again, I had no idea except for, you know, doing the research for this pod beforehand. And he, you know, directed, you know, something called In Cold Blood a year after In Cold Blood came out, right? You know, it was very, you know, documentary-like, you know, shot in real locations, quite stark. And I think at its time, it was very influential, you know, when that came out. But obviously inspired by the book, and then he decides to do that and obviously give it the same title. So I also think, you know, I mean, obviously Bennett Miller directed Capote, right? So for him to say, oh, it's influenced him, that's you know, it's like saying, hey, you know, the water's wet, right? But But I actually think, one of Miller's other movies, 2014's Foxcatcher, it kind of like channels this, similar cold psychological tone of In Cold Blood.
Yes, right? I agree with that.
So I'll get into my last category, right, which is TV series and documentaries, right? So there was Making a Murderer. So again, it was a long-form true crime telling story on Netflix, came out 2015.
Almost the original series in that manner.
100%. It was about sort of like, we actually had two subjects, but it ended up zeroing in on this kind of like, at the time of the crime, young 16-year-old who was troubled, called Brendan Dassey, right? But again, this is like a clear heir or like generation 3 or 4, whatever, of In Cold Blood. So I think that was quite, and then same year. So again, like really something in the air, right? And it's interesting that both these TV series, even limited in nature, they came out roughly, a decade after these two films. So again, I think the public interest and people's desire for this content and learning more, and streaming really started to sort of, just converge and then, just get louder and louder. I don't think the wave's crested yet. Like it's still rising.
Yeah.
But The Jinx came out in 2015 as well on HBO. And again, it was like very meticulous investigation and narrative build-up of Robert Durst's crimes. And again, a very sort of like, sort of like follow the mold that Capote had manufactured or produced for In Cold Blood.
Yes.
Now, the final one that I wanted to mention was Mindhunter, right?
Which is Fincher again.
Produced by Fincher, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, I think it only had 2 seasons, if memory serves me. I loved Mindhunter, and I wish they did a third, but apparently as good as it was, as high as the quality was, it wasn't making enough money, didn't get enough eyeballs. But again, Fincher again, right? And just the, obviously the psychological focus on the killers and the very careful procedural tone, really does resemble In Cold Blood's, treatment and sometimes intimate treatment of, both Perry Smith and, Dick Hickok in Cold Blood.
I think it's as essentially and it's probably very true, like a lot of films and things we've been involved in over the years, is they all have In Cold Blood in their DNA.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's even quite like it's even lines in the films are, this will be the first ever non-fiction novel, right? He says it, they say it in the film. I think they say it in both films because that's what he was doing. That's what he wanted to create, which is interesting considering, and again, which is part of the scenario, is that this all stemmed from a tiny newspaper clipping in the New York Times that he read and wanted to go out there to interview to see how these crimes affected that small town in Kansas. Yeah. And turned into this genre-changing, complex crime novel.
And, and arguably it has even sort of like greater impact. And I'm not to say that this is the first one that had done it or otherwise. I haven't done research completely unprepared, but something just popped into my mind is that just the recontextualization of IP and how important IP became. Because, back in the 60s, I think, or even like late 50s when he first kind of like came up with the idea or whatever, drawing inspiration from, to your point, a small newspaper article. Well, fast forward 20, 25, 30 years later, not to say everyone's doing that, but that's become quite a popular go-to.
Yes.
Right? Or inspiration for other pieces, sort of like pieces of art, in its broader sense, right?
Yeah.
But dare I suggest, like back then, he was certainly, I think, an early adopter. If I'm not saying that he created, but certainly an early adopter. And like you fast forward to now, and like I haven't seen the entire season yet, but I think it's called The Studio with Seth Rogen on Apple, right? And and they are sort of like taking the absolute P155 out of the over reliance that Hollywood actually has on IP when they want to do a movie about Kool-Aid, right? And it's just hilarious. But you think tracing back again, like late 50s, like this guy having that idea, it's like genius. I mean, like there's a reason that this novel is so influential, right? And it's impacted, to your point, like so many people either directly or indirectly over the decades since its release.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the thing was, Capote was already famous anyway for his screenplays and his writing prior to doing this. So, the fact that he could just pick that up and go, this is my idea, this is what I want to do. And everyone's like, yeah, go for it. And again, the way it turned out is phenomenal because of, it's not like he went out there, spent all these years being tormented by this story which is part of what the films are trying to come across. It's not just that, the whole brutality of the killing, but also the psychology of the killers, and therefore their final journey to fight to the execution, spoiler alert, which, as he said, he couldn't finish the novel until that occurred.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, it's just... But then obviously, as history says, and the common thing I found in research, and I'm sure you found the thing, is he was never able to finish a book again after this.
Yeah, it was maybe sort of like, too much too soon, but then also how over-invested he was in the overall, sort of a book in the process, and otherwise kind of destroyed him, right? Kind of, it was the beginning of the end for him in that regard. But, as we're talking about the influence and otherwise, we've talked about, the genius of Capote and what have you. I think let's address the elephant in the room, shall we, right? Because like this to me kind of like smacks of, Jean-Paul Sartre was an absolute, sort of like hero and legend as an existentialist. And, Simone de Beauvoir says, hold my beer, right? I mean, another hugely influential, existentialist and philosopher, not necessarily given the same due that Jean-Paul Sartre was, and they were lovers and so on and so forth, right? Now you've got a really fascinating combination, like one of the most amazing literary duos at the peak of their powers, who just happen to be besties, in Nell Harper Lee, who wrote a little book called To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes,
right.
Yes,
and she's playing sort of like Huckleberry, or sort of like second in charge, or sort of like able and willing assistant in this one. And like, I mean, come on, right? I mean, talk about one and done, like she was To Kill a Mockingbird, and I mean that goes down as one of the greatest novels of all time.
Well, Pulitzer Prize winning, as we know,
right?
And yeah, again, another strong literary influence. You know what I mean? And just the fact that she is just almost the assistant in these films, or even to him at the time, which again did happen, is just incredible.
But I mean, the thing that kind of like sticks out at me is that, like, the real Truman Capote sounds like it was a bit of a dick, right? Because like now Harper Lee again would have had like an outsized impact and influence on this. I mean, my research suggests that in 1965 she actually edited the final draft for In Cold Blood, right?
Okay.
And again, like when In Cold Blood was published, Capote didn't give Nell Harper Lee any credit.
Yes,
right? He did dedicate the book to her, right? And at the time, his longtime partner, Jack Dunphy, I thought more memorably played by Bruce Greenwood in Capote, for what it's worth. Maybe the Infamous one was probably a little bit closer. I didn't do any research on that.
Yep.
And, Lee, again, my research suggests that she was pretty hurt / pissed, I think, by this slide, given the time, effort and work that she put into the book, right? And, apparently, despite, sort of like that. And again, like, she plays a huge role in both movies, right?
Absolutely.
Obviously larger and Infamous, and it really kind of like almost seems more like a buddy movie or a road movie at times. But, a very, larger than life or outsized figure in Capote, right? But, despite that, there must have been, some level of, acrimony, probably from both ends for different reasons.
Well, what I found, or what I, in my research came up, was that they started drifting apart after the publication of In Cold Blood. Right. Same thing again, but no one can really be sure, is it because he was jealous that she won the Pulitzer for To Kill a Mockingbird? Or others say, is it because, again, he didn't thank her? He may have dedicated the novel, but he didn't thank her for what she did to help him with the novel.
And you know what? That's where I will say that there's that scene in Capote, and I think it's the film premiere of To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And Capote is, he's getting sauced.
Yep.
And he's having a martini by himself. And Nell Harper Lee comes over, and Capote just goes into hardcore narcissist mode, and he's just talking about himself and otherwise, even though this is a pretty big occasion for his best friend who, really dedicated a lot of her self and time and otherwise helping him with his most influential book of all time. Right? Yeah. And Capote had already observed a level of, success, especially in movies and otherwise, obviously with Breakfast at Tiffany's, right? And I think the way that, the genius of Philip Seymour Hoffman kind of like capturing that, and in all fairness, like the minimalist kind of stripped back acting that Catherine Keener has at the time, like that is such a powerful, poignant scene that I think really kind of like, at least dramatically, captures in a soundbite or synthesis or a, sort of a clip form.
Yeah.
what was kind of going on beneath the surface between those two, right?
Yeah.
But apparently, I don't know if they ever sort of became great mates again, but I think there was some form of olive branch, or maybe it was like, nostalgia or a trip down memory lane. But, apparently, I think 2 years after, in Cold Blood, they took a road trip together, right?
Oh, okay.
Through South Alabama, right?
Yeah, right.
Where obviously they both grew up. So I didn't track it too closely as to where they went from there, but I thought it would be remiss of us not to talk about, the influence that Nell Harper Lee, or Harper Lee, she's more commonly referred to, had on, again, one of the most influential books that came out. And it's amazing to think that, she had her fingerprints on two of the most influential books.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
It's almost like, if Scott Fitzgerald did 2 Great Gatsbys or something. I mean, I don't think there's many authors who've got that. Right? So, kudos to her.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Do you want to get into the nitty-gritty? Should we talk some numbers? Because I found this really interesting if you want to talk the numbers.
Jeff, roll me through it.
All right. So, as you said, Capote came first, and I know we'll talk a bit about production as we get there later at delays. So, Capote came first, September 30th, 2005, which was actually released on purpose because that was Capote's 81st birthday, or would have been Capote's 81st birthday.
Right.
That's why it was released on that date in particular.
Well done.
Now, it was released on limited release, so the numbers are a bit skewed when they do that. So it only took 324,000 its opening weekend, but ended up going wide, took 28.7 domestically, took another 21.2 internationally, so worldwide about 49.5, 50 million bucks, right?
Right.
With a tight budget, like you said, because it was leaner and meaner, of only $7 million, nice 7x return for the studio at that point.
Beautiful.
Okay? But then you look at Infamous, which came out in November 2006. So a year later, like you also said, because it was delayed for awards season to try and catch up with the late 2006-2007 award season, Oscars and so forth, but did dramatically different. Now, it opened on 179 screens and took 456,000. So it took 100,000 more, but on 10 times the screens.
Right.
It did not do great business. It closed with a measly 1.15 million domestically, and internationally only took another 1.46 million, so a worldwide total of 2.6 was all it took.
So it only really doubled its opening.
Yeah.
Like at a high level.
Yes.
Wow.
But it had a larger budget, double the budget at 13 million of Capote.
Right.
So it returned less than 0.2x for the studio. So
that's fascinating that it actually had. I guess the more I think about it, I think there's a lot more flourish from a production design with Infamous and that. But that does surprise me because, not knowing the ins and outs, looking at both films, they both had the same budget.
Yeah.
Right? So, kudos to the makers of Capote.
Well, absolutely. And then again, this being in the era of hard media.
Yeah.
There's no numbers on Infamous's DVDs because I'm going to assume, given its box office, either A, no one wanted it, or B, they just didn't report it. But Capote took another 17 million in DVD sales as well back in the day, which is not a bad result in 2005 when, we still had hard media, but probably coming towards the peak of that.
Interesting.
Knowing that we started streaming not too far down the track. So, for a small, independent, low budget, we're talking $67, $68 million in total sales. Not bad.
It's pretty incredible. And so then sort of take us through the critic and the audience reactions to both these films.
Well, they're both done quite, they both have decent scores. Like Capote, not as strong from Infamous, but Capote sits at 89% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Solid.
Which is really good. As of now, it's got 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb and a Metacritic score of 88. So good, solid numbers there.
Right.
Infamous has a decent 75% on Rotten Tomatoes, so not a bad number. 7 out of 10 on IMDb, so very similar to Capote in a way, and a 68 on Metacritic. So again, not seen as overly dramatically different in their critic scores. Yeah. Audience scores, Capote has at 82% on the Popcorn-O-Meter from Rotten Tomatoes, but from over 100,000 reviews. Whereas Infamous is at 69%, but that's only from 10,000 plus reviews.
Right.
So I think considering the talent involved in front of the camera on both films, and again, no laughing matter on either of them. One wasn't more low budget or B-listed people. They're A-listers across the board. But I'm really surprised. To me, I'm really surprised at the numbers that Infamous got because, maybe I could see, like you said, and again, when you're talking about the historical nature of this and the influences of even the films, right? Capote was very much the trendsetter, was the one seen as the stronger film, obviously, as I'm sure we're going to mention at some point, the Oscar, the buzz, the awards, the Oscar for Hoffman, whereas Infamous kind of was obviously compared too closely to that and then kind of just disappeared into the ether. You know what I mean? I didn't look into this. What marketing did they put behind Infamous? Were they going to push it in a way? I think part of the reason what I found was that Warner Independent actually delayed it that year and a half almost,
right,
or that full year, not just for awards time the following year, but to give themselves distance. So
it's interesting about the cast. Like, we usually do this later. I think we're kind of like bouncing around a little bit with this pod because I think it really captured our imagination with how twinny it was, and really kind of I got the sort of like the juices flowing and otherwise. But let me jump into the cast now. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I would say at a high level, ensemble, Infamous has got the stronger cast, and certainly on paper.
Absolutely.
Right? However, that being said, the three kind of like key characters in Capote on balance are better than the three key characters in Infamous, right? So let me break this down, right? So I'll start with Capote first. Obviously, you've got Seymour Hoffman, as I said, who I absolutely adore. And like, he was coming off some sort of streak. I mean, he had Talented Mr. Ripley in 1999, David Mamet Stayed in Maine, and Almost Famous in 2000, right? Paul Thomas Anderson's Punch Drunk Love, Red Dragon and Spike Lee's 25th Hour in 2002, Cold Mountain in 2003, Along Came Polly in 2004 that had Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston, and then this in 2006, followed by Mission Impossible 3.
In the same year.
Same year.
Yeah, right.
Right? I mean, like, that is a streak.
Absolutely.
Like, that is amazing, right? Yeah. And I mean, like, he deserves, everything because, like, he's such a great actor. Catherine Keener, I'd also say maybe it was kind of like peak Hoffman. I'd also say it's probably peak Keener.
Okay.
Right? Because Catherine Keener, she was coming off being John Malkovich in 8mm.
Yep. And
8mm, again, is like kind of like a one of those guilty pleasures. That's a Nicolas Cage film directed by Joel Schumacher. And it's also got Joaquin Phoenix in it as well. But she was in that. She does Adaptation in 2002. And then The 40-Year-Old Virgin and The Interpreter, that was the one with Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn.
Yep.
She did both of those in 2005. This in the same year, right? And then the next thing she does post this, I guess, of note, is Into the Wild, which came out in 2007. That had Emile Hirsch and Vince Vaughn.
Oh, yeah.
So again, you could actually say it was actually peak Keener as well as it was peak Hoffman.
True.
And both like super, super amazingly talented sort of actors. Chris Cooper was really coming into his own. I don't know what Pete Cooper is. I haven't really thought about this, right? But he was coming into his own, right? So he does American Beauty in 1999, The Patriot in 2000 with Mel Gibson and Heath Ledger, The Bourne Identity and Adaptation, both in 2002, Seabiscuit in 2003. Then he does this. And then he does Jarhead and Syriana in 2005, right? I mean, amazing, right?
Yeah.
And the only other character of note I wanted to say, as I said, is Bruce Greenwood, because I've always loved Bruce Greenwood. He starred in I, Robot with Will Smith in 2004. He does this in 2005. And then he does 8 Below with Paul Walker in 2006.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what was kind of like Pete Greenwood, and I haven't looked into that either. But as I said, it was really...
He's consistent. That's all. He's everywhere. Right? He's an everyman.
Yeah.
He's an everyman, Bruce Greenwood.
But it jumped out at me that, Hoffman and Keener, this was kind of, the peak, I think, for both of them.
Okay.
So let's go to the ensemble cast of, Infamous. Obviously, it centers around Toby Jones, who I think is remarkable. He's amazing in this. And again, his first star turning, like I mentioned before.
Yeah.
He again, it was quite a transition because you think he'd always been a supporting character and, I think he was very prolific in stage as well. He had a small but memorable role in Finding Neverland with Johnny Depp and Kate Winslet. and also in Ladies in Lavender with Judi Dench and Maggie Smith. Both came out in 2004. He does Mrs. Henderson Presents, again a small part role, but memorable, with Judi Dench and Bob Hoskins in 2005. Then he does this and has supporting roles in Amazing Grace with Ian Grufford and Albert Finner. And then he does The Painted Veil with Naomi Watts and Edward Norton, all in 06.
Wow.
Right? So again, you know, tremendous kind of, you know, supporting actor and character actor and otherwise. And this was meant to be his first sort of like breakout role, but I think he handles it with aplomb and delivers quite a magnificent performance. Sandra Bullock, again, and like the enduring sort of like nature of her sort of like charm and of her craft and her career, it amazes me. Like, I always love it when you think, you know, I really liked that person back then. You're still loving them like 30, 35 years later from their debut.
Yeah.
But she was coming off Crash in 2004. She does Miss Congeniality 2 in 05. And then she does this and The Lake House with Keanu Reeves in 06, followed by The Premonition, and then The Proposal with Ryan Reynolds and her Oscar-winning role in The Blind Side in 2009. So you'd maybe argue that this was probably peak Sandra Bullock.
Or maybe heading to peak Sandra Bullock if Oscar winning is her peak.
That's got to be a peak.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
But, you know, this is, in terms of her roles, like she'd obviously gone from that starting just, you know, your pretty girl speed thing into those.
Don't forget Demolition Man.
You can never forget Demolition Man.
I mean, like, kind of like that, like that is the one too. That was when I was all in on.
Yeah.
Sandra Bullock, and, you know, except for some of the, you know, the sort of like more female sort of, you know, focused films that she did. Otherwise, I was all in on pretty much everything she did from that point forward.
Oh,
right?
She's always been a favourite.
But then also, like, talk about capturing people just before they're about to take off. You know, you've got Daniel Craig, right? So he's coming off Road to Perdition in 2002, Layer Cake in 2004, Munich in 2005. Then he does this and debuts as James Bond in Casino Royale in 06.
Well, the thing is that this came out, I think, a month before Casino Royale was released, because even though it shot it a year and a half beforehand, because of the delay that Warner Independent did to push this into award season, this released a month before Casino Royale.
So it's kind of like the amuse-bouche before.
That's right.
Before a little film called Casino Royale came out.
Yeah.
And then I'm not finished, but I've got a final one in, you know, Jeff Daniels. I mean, the cast is stacked, right? Now, he's coming off Bloodwork with Clint Eastwood and The Hours with Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman, and Julianne Moore that came out in 2003, both of those films. He does The Squid and the Whale, Because of Winn-Dixie, and Good Night and Good Luck, all in 2005. And then he does this and RV with Robin Williams in 2006. Now, I also want to mention, if that cast isn't stacked enough, you've also got small roles by Sigourney Weaver, Gwyneth Paltrow, Isabella Rossellini, Hope Davis, and the director, Peter Bogdanovich.
Exactly.
Right? I mean,
right.
like, they all appear very small, but it's just distinctive roles. And it's like, oh my goodness, one, obviously, they weren't doing it for a paycheck. They're doing it out of love. But what a stacked cast.
That's what that goes back to that, why I can't understand why this film didn't do better business, right? Again, is it purely because of what Capote was? We'll never know.
I mean, but like, maybe it was just one of those things where sort of timing really was everything. And those professionals at the studio and, you know, the producers and otherwise, they felt in their bones, and it became like a foot race, right? Because they know that first past the line or first past the post, we're going to take the chocolates, right? And maybe because there was only a limited audience for this type of story, and otherwise, so once people had seen it, they'd seen it.
Yeah, right? That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, they couldn't do it. But again, because I'd never seen Infamous, when I sat down and watched it, and I sat there and went, wait a minute, and you see the names, and I was like, what? I was like, what? It was like roll call at the Oscars for some years, you know?
Exactly. I mean, like, it's interesting. Like, I reflect back on one of the earlier pods where we did White House Down versus Olympus Had Fallen, right? And I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, G, but do you remember that they both kind of like tapped out at similar figures?
Yes.
Right? Like, they made a similar amount of box office.
150 or something like that, I think. Yeah. I remember,
whatever it was. So like, there was, so again, like, but there was obviously enough appetite for audience to see at a high level both films.
Yes.
Whereas for this one, for reasons that we won't know, right, there was only appetite to really see one version of this film. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, you could always ask the question, is it some level of cultural that people thought, well, people who just went, well, that was the definitive version by Hoffman, so why don't we need to see again? You're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, that's really, like, as I said, it's really interesting the people in each film, I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow literally sings a song in the opening scene and then that's it. But you get Gwyneth Paltrow to do that is huge getting something like that to do it.
And I think she does it extremely well, by the way. And like that performance, just incredible. And also, actually, when I was watching that performance, it made me think that she could have been in a David Lynch film, right? And it's funny that like Isabella Rossellini, who obviously was in, Blue Velvet, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, I have to think about that David Lynch film, playing that sort of, ingenue of sort of like some description, and how emotional her performance is as well, very raw and, exposed and otherwise, felt like a bit of a David Lynch trope, to be honest, seeing her perform. So it was interesting, just as a bit of a, parallel, at least, for me, or how my mind works, kind of like pinballing that association back to Lynch, and, the fact that Isabella Rossellini is a bit of a sort of like touchstone there for me and otherwise. But anyway, that's just how my mind works.
Well, I think it also, I think that's part of and that's obviously why they've got those names in there, is just those differences. Where the films differ with each other is Capote strips back all his interactions with the other, as they're called the swans. That's what they were called, the swans, his swans, right? So those high society New York ladies that are played by Sigourney and Isabella and Hope Davis were obviously not in Capote, but were done inside of Infamous, because, and I thought it was quite a neat interaction, the way, he would tell a story about what's going on in Kansas, about Perry Smith or Hickok, but he'd be talking to the three of them. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then he said, right, and then one of them laughs, and then it cuts to him going, but then this happened, and it's like there's the other one. And I thought it was an interesting story. It was an interesting choice for the film, right? So, but again, if you know that, then there's the Ryan Murphy in his series Feud actually did the story of when Capote screwed over these ladies, called The Swans vs. Capote. So there's an actual TV series that was made within the last 5 years called Feud, The Swans vs. Capote, where because he wrote about, in the end, and again, obviously at this point it was towards the end of his career, I think, he was known to be an alcoholic at that point and struggling with everything.
Right.
So he wrote something for the New Yorker and articles about each of these ladies and those secrets that he'd been holding on to for so many years, right? And obviously, basically, he screwed them over completely. And then they went to town on him at the same time. So, and then Ryan Murphy, prolific TV producer, has turned it into one of his shows. So
maybe some other research is sort of attendance at his funeral. Right? Yeah, well, I mean, if you're going to go out in flames, I guess.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating.
But I think also lends to that title that you said, the big word salad. I can't even remember what it is now because it was so long.
It was a lot.
About the fact that there was all negative connotations about him in there. And obviously he was a difficult man. He must have been a difficult man to know at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And it's interesting, those sort of two echoes, like, you remarked as to, he was successful, he was writing for the New Yorker, he had this, small newspaper clipping based on this article, and, had, the cachet behind him at the time to say, hey, look, I'm going on, sort of like a fishing trip or hunting expedition or otherwise. I have no idea, how long it's going to take or what it's going to cost or whatever, but, I need you to back my play here, right? And I don't know how much of that was self-funded versus kind of like getting, advances or otherwise, or dispensation as time off. I don't know, sort of obviously his employment or sort of like the structure of, financially how this was, came to be over those sort of like, 5-6 years that the book took to write. But he would have just had amazing power at the time to be able to have that freedom and luxury to do that. Right? I mean, the world's better for it, but yeah, it's just incredible. Hey, so listen, why don't we get into the directors? Because we usually do that before the cast.
Yeah.
Unless there's any other comments you want to make about the numbers?
No, I think the number, as I said, it's just purely how they turned out. That was it, which I think I've already explained. But yeah, let's move on to the directors. So this was Bennett Miller's directorial film debut, right? He did do a documentary called The Cruise about a New York
sort of like, tour operator, used to ride on the ferries and otherwise. Then he goes on to make Moneyball, roughly sort of 5-6 years after this in 2011, and then Foxcatcher in 2014, which is a pretty solid run, right? I think that's pretty incredible. Whereas for Infamous, a decade earlier, the director Douglas McGrath made Emma with Gwyneth Paltrow. In 2000, he made Company Man with Sigourney Weaver. In 2002, he made Nicholas Nickleby with a young Charlie Hunnam.
Yep.
And then he made this in 2006. Then, a bit of a gap, and he does I Don't Know How She Does It in 2011 with Sarah Jessica Parker. And then that was kind of it for him for features, right? I mean, TV-wise, he did a documentary on the incredible filmmaker Mike Nichols.
Yeah.
But but this is kind of like close to the end for him. Obviously, sort of, I think, set a different course in motion for his career. Whether it was good or bad, I think it was just different. But it certainly, I think, would have had an impact given the numbers that you've just taken us through earlier.
Yeah, and we all know how fickle sometimes Hollywood could be depending on how your films turn out. So, look, obviously from his films he directed prior, he had history with some of the ladies who actually are in Infamous. Right. Again, may have attributed to how he was able to get them to come in for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenes, whatever it may be. Who knows? But, it's interesting that, like Bennett Miller has made 3 really solid awards-worthy films, right?
Yeah.
Like Big Strong, like that kind of thing. I'm not saying McGrath's stuff is denigrated in any way, but, still well-known films, but maybe not in the sense of having the same level of almost infamous in a way in terms of how they weren't as strong in terms of, let's say, award stuff. And I know it's not all about awards. People make films purely for entertainment. But, definitely interesting, especially because when you looking up Douglas McGrath, I recognise his face. He's one of those guys you've seen in films from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Like I remember looking at him going on IMDb going, yeah, I know who this guy is. I can't remember what he's been in, but I know his face.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
So, seen him around.
Hey, so where from here? I mean, I think you and I were comparing and contrasting notes on, the very deliberate choices that were made around production design.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because, there is, disparity is not the word, the differences in the production design of these films, right? I mean, for me, I was looking at Capote and you can see very much that it's a very muted and restrained palette they did for that throughout, not just the stuff in New York, but also in Kansas. I mean, Kansas was obviously meant to be portrayed as that sort of downward crime place where the murder happened. So it's meant to be seen in that sort of muted palette. But the fact that New York is portrayed in the same way with, your browns and your greys and your whites, it's very sepia heavy in terms of the way they did things. So it just felt cold in terms of the way it was, which I think was, reflecting Capote's descent into the way he was, where his journey was taking him. But yeah, that's what I found in regards to that. Like just the color palette was not monotone's not the word, but very muted. Yeah. Right? But it was, it's a very accurate, the portrayal of both areas, New York being timeless and austere, but also, detailed with regards to how they've done things in Kansas and everything across that way. An interesting fact, if you'd like to know this, is that that's an infamous fact, a fact for Infamous, which actually I'll come back to that. But whereas I think the muted colours reflected Capote's psychology. Do you know what I mean? Yes. The fact that he was very much stuck in with this story. Once he got into it, he was stuck in it. He couldn't move forward. It took years of his life to get done.
Yeah.
And every time anyone asked him about it, he couldn't get past it, right? And even history shows that, and we've already talked about how this film dragged him down and almost destroyed him is not word, but psychologically affected him so deeply that he couldn't bring himself to finish a book again after this, but almost was this what led him to become the alcoholic that then eventually killed him because of his incredible use of alcohol and drugs at the time. So yeah, it was definitely more muted compared to Infamous.
Well, yeah, it's quite incredible that you mention that because, not only did he obsess over every detail and then build an emotional connection with the killers and obviously one killer in particular, but kind of, psychologically isolated himself, kind of walled himself off. And, to your point, maybe he was speculating, which is always dangerous, but, maybe he then started to kind of, sort of project that out to the rest of the world and started to, close off other parts of his life as he was maniacally focused on this one thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me sort of like study and contrast talk about Infamous. Obviously, bolder colors, sharper silhouettes. There's really kind of like a tactile lushness, to the film that you don't see in that, cold, austere, muted, restrained palette that you were mentioning around, Capote. New York is the contrast, feels more lived in and kind of era specific, with the nightclubs, jazz bars, breakfast tables. Everything's got that mid-century design, and it really evokes that late 50s, early 60s glamour, including, some kitsch. Capote's wardrobe, which I touched on very briefly, and the gossip circuit, everything feels like a postcard or a real-world snapshot from, sort of a 1959, sort of, early 60s New Yorker cartoon, right? Very camp, stylish, vivid, and otherwise. I think, period accuracy for this one is probably more tied to what it was like in the late 50s from decor, fashion, and social settings based on, just images and otherwise from the era.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a sharper contrast with, and this is a contrast in itself to Capote, which you said they both kind of feel a little bit bleak and otherwise, where there's more of a kind of like fish out of water aspect every time we, go back to New York or we come to Kansas from one to the other. There really is that, juxtaposition of two very, hey, we're in the same country, speaking the same language, but very, very different lifestyles, right? And very different places. So, sort of like maybe at a higher level, if we had to synthesize that, maybe, would you say, Jeff, that from a literal, if I can speak properly, literal period realism perspective, maybe Infamous takes the chocolates?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, even thinking about it now, and it's just come back to me, is that I do even remember with Capote at one point thinking you can't tell where he is, in the sense that, there's scenes of him by himself walking into a room to sit down and start typing because he's writing the book, which again, you don't really see in Infamous, is that Capote, he's very much writing the book as he goes, whereas they don't really talk about that as much in Infamous. So, but the difference being that I remember him sitting down and writing and going, so where is he? Thinking, is he in New York or is he in Kansas while he's doing this?
Yeah.
You can't tell because they've kept that very similar theme in the colour palette all the way through the entire feature.
Yep.
So,
again, I think you sort of like touch on this, maybe the way that we'd synthesize the authenticity of the more realness for Capote is more in that sort of emotional or atmospheric sense. It's like it has more realism in that regard, to what was happening. And clearly it was, Kafka-esque in terms of its transformation of this literary icon, right? I mean, huge breakout hit with Breakfast at Tiffany's, really well respected for all his other works and otherwise, but this is when the worm turned for him.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Biggest, most celebrated, but yeah, that was kind of, again, the beginning of the end.
Well, Pete Capote in a sense,
Pete Capote, 100%. Hey, so, talking about other things that jumped out in the film, can I hit you up with one thing that jumped out at me? It's a piece of music, right? It's in Infamous. It's when Toby Jones first enters the Clutter House in Infamous, right? And it's actually part of Rachel Portman's original score. It just features a clarinet and a violin and has a very soft sort of, harp and piano drone, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this sense of like, sort of tension, the clarinet and the violin duo is kind of tragically expressive and they really take center stage to this piece of music. And the combination kind of creates this like subtle haunting quality with distant echoes and resonance. It's almost, it's very atmospheric. The clarinet, it feels very melancholic and, almost gives a bit of a wind instrument feel akin to a harmonica, right?
Yeah.
And that's where my mind the wheels of my mind started to turn because I went, I think there's a very similar emotional resonance between that piece of music and Ennio Morricone's Man with a Harmonica from Once Upon a Time in the West.
Right. Okay.
So even though they may differ in instrumentation and structure, right, they share kind of like key atmospheric and thematic similarities. Like, there's, haunting minimalism. Both pieces are built around very spare and haunting melodies with long pauses and drawn out notes, right? And again, there's really that sense of unease and melancholy that's really created with, the stripped back quality of each piece. That use of a singular, piercing tone or note or otherwise. Obviously, it's the harmonica, it's raw, reedy, almost ghost-like.
Yep.
In Infamous, obviously, the clarinet, which is, very breathy and mournful, if you will. Both instruments, kind of evoke that, it's not wistfulness, it's more like loneliness and like interior pain as well, but someone being reflective about something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or a series of things. And, both, share that, the emotional tone where there's this sense of inevitability and tragedy and quiet doom, right? They kind of like, soft prep the audience for emotional devastation, right? As you know, in Leone's, it's, it's a reckoning, right? And Infamous, it's, the beginning of the end, the sort of growing weight of Capote's kind of like descent into, well, it's not just moral ambiguity, right, where it crosses the line, becomes mates with the killers, but, the other demons that he starts to
absolutely
wrestle with.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you pick that up at all?
No, I'll be honest, I didn't. But yeah, maybe I was looking at things in a different way. But no, I mean, the music, the scores were both, great. I think they both expressed it. I think, the thing about both these films is it starts off in one way, but then once he gets to know those killers and it turns and you see his descent, and again, the similarities in these films, like the big one for me that first jumped out was when the scene where both of them first meet Alvin Dewey, the lawyer, the captain.
Yeah.
And both of them refer him to as Foxy when they leave the thing. Now, Capote says it and moves on, but Infamous, he actually then starts referring to Dewey as Foxy. But they literally repeat the same line with, that man was very foxy. It's exactly the same line in both films, right? Which I found extraordinary in the way they do it, which obviously meant at some point in the books that these are based on, it must have been mentioned.
100%.
Right? So, but also I think, and again, this goes back to the production design and what you're saying in the music and the way it's invoking that is that each of these, Hoffman and Jones, play the descent of Capote while he's dealing in those years with Perry Smith and Dick Hickok in different ways.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Capote, as you said, because of the colour scheme and the way he is and his costume and everything, always remains the same, but then slowly opens up while he gets Perry Smith to open up to him, but never truly reveals himself. Whereas in Infamous, there's that contrast of it's almost he's trying, and again, it's part of the research and people have discussed this, is that he's trying to, it's almost like because he can see his own history in Perry Smith, that he feels free to talk about who he really is, not the Truman Capote that New York knows he is.
Right.
Or the world knows he is. This is the demon of who the real Truman Capote is. So, which again, I think is that contrast between the music, between the colour palette, between the, everything, the style of the whole film, which is, very interesting.
Hey, so let's do a quick kind of like, compare in terms of, preferences. We don't have to justify them unless you want to add sort of, a sentence or two and otherwise, but let's go with the leads first, right? So Philip Seymour Hoffman or Toby Jones for you?
I think I preferred Hoffman. I think the softer, more nuanced version of Capote for me worked more.
Yeah.
And again, we don't know who the real man was, but and people say that Jones was almost more accurate in his portrayal of Capote. But I think in terms of how it worked with that film and that version, Capote was the better one for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think just, again, like Toby Jones gives an amazing performance. And like, I really feel for the guy as well because he gives an incredible performance, right? And, you look at a lot of the, the Oscars that have been handed out over the last sort of like, 20 years, 25 years, is a lot of them go to real life characters, right? And mimicry and imitation become, they start to have a bit of an outsized role and otherwise, and that can't be underplayed in terms of how important that is.
Yeah.
But the emotional depth of Hoffman's performance, I think, just kind of, takes that to another level.
Yes.
But here's another fun fact for you, right? This isn't the first time that Toby Jones has been, overshadowed by someone else playing the same character as him. It happened to him roughly 6 years later, right? With contrasting Hitchcock films, right? So, you've got Toby Jones giving a more accurate portrayal to the real life character than Anthony Hopkins did. But, Anthony Hopkins' version crowded out all the light for Jones's version of the girl, right?
Yeah, right.
I think that was only TV where, Hopkins actually got, theatrical release and otherwise. And again, gives a more accurate performance of a historical figure, but the bigger film, flashier film, I don't know,
overshadowed it.
Kind of overshadowed. I mean, I haven't deconstructed or whatever, so I'm kind of like going off memory. I remember liking both films. I don't have a strong memory as to the performances in both, other than I love Hitchcock and I love both those two actors. But yeah, for Jones, Echoes getting overshadowed 6 years later for another brilliant performance of a real life character.
Well, I guess it's unfortunate, really, isn't it?
That's showbiz, brother.
Yeah, exactly right.
Apparently,
right? Breaks kids.
So, hey, look, I did a bit of a scan, as you know that we always do on these films, to see if there's any Aussie connection or Australian connection for those not from Australia who may or may not be listening. Found zero.
Okay.
So
I don't think I have anything on that.
That made me sad.
Yeah.
So maybe, should we talk about like trivia or fun facts, Jeff?
Well, let's start with this. So I've got a few alternate casting people that were in these roles.
Hit me.
So it was originally discussed, but I don't think it ever moved anywhere, is that they actually talked about Sandra Bullock for the role of Harper Lee in Capote.
Oh, that's incredible.
So, which she then eventually went on to do in Infamous. I don't think it was ever turned into something to do with an offer, but I believe that was that. Now, on Infamous, Mark Wahlberg was originally attached to play Perry Smith, and he had to drop out in August 2004. He was replaced by the Hulk, Mark Ruffalo, who then dropped out in October of 2004 because he had something else to do before Daniel Craig took the role. Right? Michelle Pfeiffer was originally supposed to play the role of Slim Keith, but she dropped out and was replaced by Hope Davis. Samantha Morton was originally cast as Harper Lee before Sandra Bullock took the role.
I think Hope Davis is actually better casting. I think more appropriate. I think Michelle Pfeiffer would have overshadowed. Yeah. Potentially.
Yeah. And originally Julia Roberts expressed interest in playing Harper Lee, but she dropped out because she fell pregnant with her twins at the time.
Fascinating.
So that's what I found with regards to that. So some interesting, different. Mark Wahlberg as Perry Smith would have been, I think, a very different film. I think.
Yeah, for me on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? I mean, his portrayal is, he's got some range. I mean, his portrayal in Boogie Nights would suggest that if you leant into that type of, frail character and otherwise, absolutely. He could certainly sort of make a good job of that role. But yeah, that's interesting.
But in doing my sort of looking at my research, so apparently for Capote, Bennett Miller, I found an interview in Filmmaker magazine where he said the screenwriter, who's named Dan Futterman, who wrote Capote, he was a friend of Miller's. He told him that he'd read an article about Capote, obviously was coming back into vogue, let's say,
right,
and decided he wanted to write a film, which he then took from the novel. So he wrote it, showed it to Miller, who said, this is great. On spec, wasn't done. And then they took it to studios to try and get it done. It was only at that point that they found out that Infamous was already underway with Warner Independent.
Right.
So they had no knowledge of it happening at the same time. They'd just gone and done it. Two gentlemen who'd read an article,
right,
decided to write a story, took it with his director mate, and this is what happened.
Interesting.
And it was only then that they found out. So, and they were always considered the underdog from the very beginning because they went in, the production company behind it, which was Infinity Media, they didn't even know if they'd get finance because Infamous was over in this corner competing against them.
Yeah, right.
But they did manage to do it. And then obviously as it came out and they got there first and buzz started coming around Hoffman's performance.
Wow.
Then Warner Media said, we're taking Infamous from here and we're putting it over here a year and a bit later.
So real underdog, sort of like reign supreme.
David versus Goliath, and it's not
prevails.
Not in the full scheme of things, but yeah, absolutely.
That's incredible.
And then the only other, I can give you a very random fact about Infamous, which I was going to mention before. So in Infamous, when they get off the train, it's called the Atchison-Topeka Railroad.
Right.
But actually the Atchison-Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad train actually ran through the actual middle of town in Holcomb, Kansas.
Oh, really?
So the whole thing of where it's just a little board in the middle of nowhere was completely made up.
Oh, okay. Film. Yeah, just
for some level of
interesting.
I guess remoteness and whatever it is. But no, the actual train literally ran through the middle of town.
So
have you got anything else?
Yeah, I've only got a handful of things, and I want to go then back to the sort of the casting. Who'd you prefer?
Yeah.
In key roles. So apparently in Infamous, Samantha Morton was originally cast as Harper Lee.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And Sigourney Weaver's first film role was in Woody Allen's Annie Hall in 1977, which actually featured the real Truman Capote in an uncredited role.
There you go.
So, the world turns, and here we are, roughly 30 years later, and she's in a film about Capote.
There you go.
And the only other couple of things that I had for Capote was Philip Seymour Hoffman lost, 40 pounds, or say circa 18 kegs or whatever, or kilos, I should say, for Capote. And in the 78th Academy Awards, Philip Seymour Hoffman was obviously nominated and won for portraying a famous person, but he was actually in competition with two other actors who played or portraying a famous person, Joaquin Phoenix for Johnny Cash in Walk the Line, and David Strathairn for Edward R. Murrow in Good Night and Good Luck. So,
which you were saying Jeff Daniels was in as well.
Yeah, so I think a real biopic, or sort of based on like real events sort of year. Obviously at the Oscars. So, quite incredible. And obviously he's up against some formidable competition, but I think it speaks to, the outsized, an incredible performance that he gave, obviously performance of his career in Capote. I mean, I've actually enjoyed him more in other films. Yeah. Right? But this one's obviously the one he got recognised for. Yeah. And, rightfully so.
Definitely.
So, Jeff, just to maybe to finish off the pod is Harper Lee. So did you prefer the portrayal of Catherine Keener, or did you prefer the portrayal of Sandra Bullock?
It's interesting. I haven't thought about this one. They were both great in the role. I don't know. I think I'd almost pick Sandy over Keener.
See, I went with Catherine Keener because even though she's got kind of like less to do, she's not as prominent otherwise, just that very understated, reaction and how expressive she is with, what she's not saying in her eyes and other things. I think that for me just kind of captured my imagination. Like Sandra Bullock, I think she's incredible, and she's so, sort of like convivial and sort of vivacious, I think, in everything that she does anyway. And she's really got that really good energy about all of her performances, and gives a really good performance as well. But, Catherine Keener is just, as I said, more Australian, more nuanced and otherwise. And, I mean, it's hard. It's almost like, hey, do you prefer a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, right? But for mine, it's Catherine Keener.
Okay. All right.
So then last one, was it Sheriff Dewey?
Alvin Dewey. Yes.
Right. So Chris Cooper or Jeff Daniels?
For me, it was Cooper, I think.
100%.
Because I think, not that Jeff Daniels did anything wrong and an excellent performance, but I think that Cooper was, again, more restrained and more of a sheriff almost than Jeff Daniels was.
And you know what? Like, I love Jeff Daniels. But like Chris Cooper's just got him covered. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he gives a good performance, but then like you've got Chris Cooper playing the same role. He wins that 10 times out of 10.
Yeah. Actually, I did have a fact about Alvin Dewey. So Chris Cooper implies in the film that if these guys get off, I'm going to come to your house and I think punch you in the face, something like that.
Right.
I think says something along those lines. So implies that he's not happy about this. And also because Capote obviously went and got legal help for the two killers because they couldn't afford their own, right, to help them through this. In reality, the two of them remained friends long after he'd been to Kansas. And so apparently Capote famously had this thing called the black and white ball that was held at the time of the release of the novel in New York. And he invited the Deweys and they attended it. So they came from Kansas all the way to New York to do it. But apparently, they remained friends after he'd left Kansas and moved on to do other things.
Oh, so, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So Chris Cooper and Hoffman would have been good buddies.
So, Jeff, what an amazing pod. And I've got to be honest, I enjoyed this one much more than I thought I was going to enjoy it when I saw it on paper, just because as I was watching it and as I said, it was just ticking all those boxes and getting our sort of like twin films juices flowing as, the most twinniest of twin films that I think we've done to date. But both just incredible films, so much to like about each one. It was an absolute pleasure really revisiting these ones as I said, and, quite an unexpected.
I agree.
So great.
Very, very interesting to look at these two unique but so similar films.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what are we doing next, Jeff?
Well, after this, we're going a little bit darker. You talked about Fincher, so why the hell let's do that? We're going to do Zodiacs. 2 Zodiac films. That's next on the list. I'll talk to you soon.
Outstanding. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, mate.
See you, mate.